currently the clinical manager at LifeWorks, where I've been working now for coming on 2 years. I'm an analytic psychotherapist by training. Actually, that's not strictly true. I started out training as a psychodynamic counsellor, and then I went on to train as a Jungian analytic psychotherapist. So I have about 22 years experience of working as a private therapist and also in the NHS. But about 2.5, 3 years ago, I took a year's sabbatical. We were moving house, and that was the point at which I decided that before I eventually go into retirement, what I really wanted to do was to bring together my professional experience as a psychotherapist and my personal experience as an alcoholic in recovery and work in the field of treatment of addicts. So that very much is my motivation for working as I am at the moment at LifeWorks, and certainly in the topic that I've decided I'd like to talk about this evening and share some of my thoughts and ideas about that. They are my ideas based on some of my experience, based on things that I have read, based on me kind of keeping an eye on current thinking and research. I suspect you've got your own ideas, and I really hope that before the end of the evening we will engage in some kind of discussion and thoughts that you may have. So, with no further ado, so the question is there such a thing as an addictive personality? And it's a big question. I know that there is a lot of debate about it, and I find it really interesting the way that people subjectively engage with this question, particularly people in recovery. For some people, the thought that they have an addictive personality is something that spurs them on to pay very close attention to their behaviour in recovery. A kind of an awareness that if they are not hyper-vigilant about their behaviour, but most importantly about their thinking, that they may act out addictively on a whole variety of things. Now I think, that in itself is very useful knowledge for the addict in early recovery. Having said that, I believe, and I hear too, that there are people who may use that almost as a rationale for behaviour. That kind of said something along the lines of, well, of course, I have an addictive personality. As though that somehow lets them off the hook for one thing or another. My interest in it, and I suppose this brings me to the next slide, which I hope is going to come up.
Point the wide end at that's it.
Why is this question important? I suppose what I'm really saying here, why is it important to me? I believe that the continuing search to understand why one person rather than another becomes an addict is essential in our attempts. It's going to annoy me, I'm sorry about this. To devise better and more effective approaches to treatment. To develop new strategies to intervene and break the pattern of addiction. To support the addict in their recovery. And to bring about changes in the way that addicts are viewed by themselves and by others. So I actually think this is a very important question. Whether or not we come to some conclusion that we can all agree on, I think it is necessarily an important question to ask, both as an addict in recovery and also as a professional working in the field of treatment. So, what do we mean by the term addictive personality? When I say we, I suppose what I'm really saying is how am I using it? What definitions have I drawn on to base this talk on this evening? One viewpoint might be that the addictive personality is created by the illness of addiction and represents a personality and biochemical change that emerges from the addictive process. So this does not refer to some kind of pre-existing personality, What this is talking about is something that emerges from the process of addiction, from that point at which an individual engages with a substance or behaviour in a way that we understand as addictive. And that it is the personality and biochemical change that is a consequence of that might be termed addictive personality. Or it might, and I think this is the definition or the understanding of addictive personality that I see most often, that it may refer to a particular set of personality traits that make an individual predisposed to addiction. According to different points of view, this may be as a consequence of genetic and neurobiological factors, or environmental and psychological factors, or indeed a synthesis of the two. I mean, for example, if I were to Google addictive personality, and Wikipedia would come up with something that looks a bit like that. And certainly, in my experience, it's quite a commonly held view that in the addict, there is some kind of predisposition. Okay. So what I'd like to do really is to have a look at both of those definitions and to perhaps come to some sense of whether or not these might be a useful way of thinking about the term addictive personality, or indeed whether the term addictive personality is actually valid or useful at all. So, to start off with then, addictive personality as a creation of addiction. And in this, a book that probably many of you have read, Knockin, The Addictive Personality, 1996, which was the second edition. But in this, he uses a process model to describe addiction. And he talks about the process of addiction as being movement, development, and change. So what he's talking about here is movement in a specific direction by the individual, i.e. repeated engagement with substance or behaviour that results in mood change and creates in the individual the illusion of control, comfort, and perfection, and the development of a dependency leading to a series of changes within a person. He describes a cycle of addiction that starts off somewhere around pain, a need to act out. Acting out, alcohol, drugs, sex, whatever that might be, a substance or behaviour, something that is sought in order to gain release from the pain. The acting out, start to feel better. That moment for the addict, but certainly it's one that is very familiar to me, even though it is many, many years since I had a drink of alcohol, that moment when the alcohol is ingested. And there is just for that moment, everything is fine. However one might want to express that. Just for that moment, I start to feel better. I'm okay. Things aren't as bad as I thought they were. In fact, things are okay. In fact, things are bloody marvellous. But as that feeling wears off, as wear off it will, the pain resulting from the acting out, physical, the shame, the guilt, the awareness of what one's doing and the consequences that it has. And yet the desire to act out is too great. So therefore the pain that is generated by the acting out, I need to act out again. And so the addict is kept in this cycle of dependency that goes round and round and round and round. And leading us to something that we might call a reductive personality. And in this, what Craig talks about is a split, shall we say, between the self, however you might choose to define the self, but if we like, the normal human side of a person. You know, often when people are in active addiction, when they're in early recovery and late recovery, they will look back on their using and they will see how their personality changed, how it became possible to behave in ways that they would not normally have done. It became possible to behave in ways that offended against their own moral code, their sense of ideal, their belief systems, the ideas and values that they were brought up with, those of their family, those of the society that they live in. This might represent the normal human side of the person, caring about other people, being interested in other people, being interested in the world and issues and all of that kind of stuff. And the addict, the side that is consumed and transformed by the addiction. What we know about the addiction is that power begins to sideline the self. And more, a personality that is driven by the need to act out on the addiction begins to come into ascendance. People will often say when they come into recovery, I want to go back to be the way that I used to be. I don't like the way that the person that I've become. And indeed that can be such a challenge in early recovery. You know, when people are sharing, talking to people, or perhaps early in treatment, and without alcohol or drugs in their system, without being able to act out, for the first time they're having to be honest about actually what their behaviour was like when they're using. And they feel really bad. And they always did feel bad. But in the past they had a means of medicating it. And it was fine as long as they kept on doing it. So, that's Craig Knockin's idea. Now, I don't think that we can talk about the changes that come about in an individual without we look at the biochemical side of things. You know, 30, 40 years ago, we did not have the benefit of neuroscience to be able to look at what is happening in the brain and around the brain chemistry in this addictive process. You know, when I think back, I think, well, how did we think this sort of addiction took hold in the way that it did? And I'm not sure what kind of answers that we had. I was busy using it at that time, so I'm afraid I never thought to even ask the question. But now, the more I understand about neuroscience, the more it helps me to see the nature of the beast. So, the dopamine hypothesis. This is one I'm sure that most of you are familiar with in one way or another. And let me say here and now, I really am not a scientist. So, and there may be those here, you know, who are very knowledgeable in this field. So I present to you a rather simplified version of my understanding of this. But for me, this has been enough to help me get a sense of what it is we're dealing with.
Ooh.
Okay.
If it is getting really annoying, so working on the space bar as well, that's easier.
Okay.
That'd be easier.
I think it will.
If it's messing around.
Okay. So, dopaminergic neurons of the midbrain are the main source of dopamine in the brain, and dopamine is closely associated with reward-seeking behaviours. When we're talking about the midbrain, we're talking about the most primitive part of the brain. The part of the brain that is involved in survival. It is the oldest part of the brain. In many ways, it is the most intense, and in early life, it is the part of us that is absolutely geared up to seek out the best way of being okay. It's about survival. No question. So when we talk about reward-seeking behaviours, what we're talking about here, at a very primitive level, are those things that make us feel okay, that make us feel safe, that make us feel good about life, that make us feel confident. So research suggests that the firing of these neurons is a motivational substance as a consequence of reward anticipation. This hypothesis is based on the evidence that when a reward is greater than expected, the firing of certain neurons increases, which consequently increases the desire or motivation towards the reward. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen Kevin McCauley's DVD, Pleasure Unwoven. He explains this absolutely beautifully. The example that he gives, and it's an American DVD, and he talks about somebody going to a gumball machine. and putting a dime in to get a gumball. Okay, so he puts the dime in, wonderful, not one gumball, but two. And this is a bit like the addict who has that experience of a drink, which is for the non-addict a drink, but for the addict, for the potential addict, for the addict with a predisposition to become addicted, this is better than expected. This is a reward that is absolutely great. It's better than expected. And what he then does, he goes to the gumball machine again, he puts in, this time he only gets one. Well, actually one is all he ever paid for. He feels disappointment. Only one? One is only what he paid for. But the point was that he had two to start with. So already the stakes are higher. Already he's becoming motivated to get something that will give him that better than expected reward. Now, of course, if he puts his dime in and gets nothing, he's in real trouble. The point is, though, he will remember that there was that time when he got two. So do you know what? I think it's worth another go. Now, what we know is that normal pleasurable experiences release dopamine. However, drugs and alcohol release huge surges of dopamine that actually confuse the brain and renders it incapable of distinguishing between good and bad experiences. Because at this point, it's not interested in, is this healthy? Is this useful? Is this going to have long-term consequences? Is this going to get me into trouble? Not at all. That would be too rational. The brain at this point is not capable of engaging with this experience in a rational way. And it places an undeserved and illusory value on the experience. So again, if we think about Craig Knockin talking about the personality, the addictive personality, and he talks about that illusion of control and perfection. In this state, it's placing a very high value on this particular experience. Something in the brain is registering, hey, that was great. In fact, it wasn't just great, it was even better than I thought it could possibly be. So for the alcoholic, the drink is not a drink. The drink is something that has delivered something better than expected. And it is the better than expected experience that holds sway and is held in memory by the chemical glutamate, which is the chemical of memory. It is the chemical of drug seeking, and it is the chemical that feeds back down to the midbrain the memory of what happened last time it was engaged with that substance or behaviour. And it says, you know what, that was great, do it again. Through repetition, and I put in brackets and or defect, because this is an important point, which we're going to come back to later. Through repetition, we know, don't we, that addiction happens to different people in different ways. There are those people who will say they were hooked at the first hit. There were other people who apparently take 10 or 15 years to get there. We know that is true. For some people it's not about repetition. It was like the first time and that's it. Everybody is different. But certainly through repetition and or defect, the brain stress system becomes overloaded. Literally, there is so much dopamine flying around in the brain does not know where it is. It is incapable of rational thought and making clear choices. So, in an attempt to restore homeostasis, and homeostasis is important because this is a state of equilibrium, of balance, that enables us as human beings to stay grounded, feet on the ground, and manage more or less the ups and downs of life. So in an attempt to restore homeostasis, stress hormones raise the hedonic set point. The hedonic set point is the pleasure set point. And this is important because what is now happening is that those things that the person used to gain pleasure from, putting a dime in a machine and getting one gumball, is no longer good enough. So the stakes have been raised So what the midbrain is looking for is something that delivers that better than expected reward. So anything less than that is stressful. It's difficult for the person to manage. Provokes difficult feelings, sense of entitlement. You know, that feeling of rage that comes from, I haven't got what I've needed, I haven't got what I've deserved. That is very, very common. Sorry?
One thing. Are you talking about because there's too much dopamine?
Yes.
I just want to...
Yes. Absolutely flooded with dopamine through repeated use. Yeah. So the hedonic set point is reset. And this leads to a condition called anhedonia, the inability to experience pleasure from activities usually found enjoyable. This is a very, very common experience in people who are addicts. It is often mistaken for depression. And that is not to say there are not addicts who will have a coexisting condition of depression that requires specific treatment. I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is that mood, that low mood, that persistent low mood and irritability. You know, the things that other people seem to find pleasurable, going for a nice walk on a lovely day, you know, meeting up with grandchildren or meeting up with a mate and going to see a film. Not enough. The person's thought is on going to the pub after, or when will I be able to get my fix? Looking at the clock, how long was it since I've had the last one? All of that kind of stuff. So anhedonia, as I say, low mood, irritability. Life is boring. Life is dull. You know, addicts will say that. Because the stakes have been raised, they have got to do something over and above in order to satisfy that pleasure set point within the brain. This leads to craving. Because at this point, having lost interest in the ordinary things in life, the things that other people find interesting, useful, pleasurable, make life worth living, actually, what there is craving. An intense emotional and obsessional experience. The craving, people will say, you know, I'm craving for a drink, I'm craving for a fix. Actually, they're not. In their mind, the craving is about the drink, or it is about the drug. But it is that absolute intense and obsessional need to find relief from what is happening inside them. This is the craving. And this is what is so hard for the addict to resist. Because the glutamate chemical that remembers the drug will tell the brain exactly what it needs. And at that point, nothing else matters. This is an intense experience, and it helps us to understand how it is people become totally preoccupied with their drug or behaviour of choice and have no room thinking about it in any other way. In terms of brain, the prefrontal cortex is the newer part of the brain. It is the part of the brain that develops later than the midbrain, which is about survival. The prefrontal cortex is about making sensible decisions, making choices, being able to think clearly about what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad, what is healthy, what is unhealthy, what is wise or unwise, and so on and so forth. But at this point, because the brain has been flooded by these constant rushes of dopamine, the capacity of the prefrontal cortex to make sensible choices is compromised. So in that moment, the addict is absolutely hooked and is not in any position to think his way out of the situation. You know, in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, they talk about there being no mental defence against the first drink. And I think that's what they're talking about there. I think that's what they're talking about. Because once a person is in that state of craving, that person cannot think their way out of it. This accounts for persistent use despite negative consequences, which I believe is one of the most important characteristics of addiction. Persistent use. You know, friends, family, professional, you know, they point the person at all the things they've lost, all the things they're going to lose. It doesn't seem to make any difference. People lose their job, they lose their relationships, they lose their children, they lose their driving license, they lose their freedom, they lose their money, their homes, yeah? They know all that, and they watch it come and they watch it go. But in response to that intense craving, there is no mental defense. So this tells us something about, and again, I think it fits very nicely with Craig Knockin's view, is that we get to that point where the addict is firmly in control. But for me, it makes perfect sense to be considering both of these things alongside, both the psychological and emotional process of addiction, but also the biochemical. But we also know that many people use drugs and alcohol relatively safely and do not become addicted, nor do they develop unhealthy relationships with sex, food, exercise, etc. It is logical, for me anyway, to assume that there may exist in certain people a susceptibility to experience these behaviours in a particular way that sets in place so significant a change in mood that the addiction process begins to take hold. And I think this leads us to some idea about predisposition, and to consider how and in what ways a person may be predisposed to addiction. And this is the argument that talks about the addictive personality being about a predisposition, certain character traits that make one person rather than another vulnerable to become addicted. So let's have a little think about that. Predisposition. What do we mean? Research indicates that between 40 and 60% of the predisposition to addiction is genetic. Genes certainly hold a great deal of information about a person's disposition. However, what we also know, it is that person's interaction with their environment that kicks those genes into action. None of us are just genes. I guess this goes back to the old nature-nurture debate. We don't tend to use those words so much these days, but actually I don't know why, because I think it makes perfect sense. It's something about the individual, unique person that we are. You know, I think about the old days when they used to have maternity hospitals where all the babies were taken off from mum at night and lined up in a nursery, yeah, taken away from mum. And if at any point you went and looked through the glass and looked at those row of babies, they would all be different. Even if they were just a few hours old, there'd be those babies who were laying there contentedly, apparently with their eyes open, looking up at the lights. There would be those who had their food fast asleep. There are others bawling their eyes off, yeah, and requiring attention. Already, at a very, very early stage, it seems that we have some kind of predisposition, some potential to experience the world in a particular way, to be able to be fed and to be satisfied and happy and go off to sleep. For another baby to be fed but still need more attention. So genes are important. Yes, they are important. And they hold a huge amount of information. But it is the interaction that a person has with their environment that will kickstart those genes. It is at that point that potential begins to be realised. It's certainly true that particular addictions do seem to run in families. However, as ever, there are always exceptions. There are many instances when there is no hereditary link whatsoever. The addiction seems to have come completely out of the blue. Or it may be that the child of a depressed mother or an abusive father becomes an addict. Or it may be that the child of alcoholic parents shows no inclination towards addiction, or one child rather than another becomes an addict. I am the daughter of an alcoholic, but I have two brothers, neither of whom, so far as I am aware, are addicts. I don't know what that says, but what it says is that it's not inevitable. You know. So what, therefore, is the nature of the predisposition? Because I think this is important. Because we might be saying, so what is it that is the predisposition? What is it that is maybe inherited in a person? Is it to be an alcoholic like my dad? Or is it something else? Might predisposition be less about a specific behaviour, i.e. addiction, and more about a vulnerability within the selfhood or biology of a person for whom addiction is a solution. may be a solution, could be a solution. Other things may also be a solution, but for the addict, clearly it's been addiction. And I think this is really important, because what we know is that when people stop using and they stop drinking or they stop taking drugs, that the best chance they have of remaining abstinent and getting well is to have ongoing support in which to work their recovery. That looks differently for different people. For some people, it's treatment centres and secondary treatment centres and tertiary treatment centres and sheltered living projects and so on. For other people, it's and 12-step fellowships. For other people, it's just a 12-step fellowship. For other people, it may be seeing a therapist on a regular basis or some other kind of self-help group or supportive group. But we do know that this is an essential part of recovery, and that without it, the person is certainly more at risk of relapse than the person who has support. That is something I think that we all pretty much accept. So I do think that this question about predisposition is important because it doesn't go away. And the point is that when the person stops using or stops drinking, I think we can safely assume that this predisposition, whatever it is still there. And if we are really going to help the person to live a meaningful and healthy life in recovery, I believe that we have to understand more about what this predisposition is and what it looks like. Right. I want to talk a little bit about the development of the self. I am an analytic psychotherapist, and I came to this work from a psychological background of wanting to think about people and their internal worlds. And I could never, whenever I talk about an internal world, I do this, as though I have some idea as though it's all happening in here. Okay, I know it's actually all happening in here. So when I say it's all happening in here, because for me, it's something physical. It's something in the body. It's something very early. It's something very primitive. In order to gain the power that addiction does, for me it makes sense to believe that it is linked to something very primitive. And again, when we go back to this whole question about dopamine, reward seeking, it's about survival. So, development of the self. All sorts of different theories about development of the self, but I thought Heinz Kohut might just give us a little bit. For those of you who know of him, then he needs no introduction. Born in the early part of the 20th century, died in 1981. He was a Freudian psychoanalyst, but he moved away from Freud's idea of the drive theory towards one of more object relations. By that, in terms of believing that a personality is formed in relation to another. And therefore, what he stressed was the importance of the relationship between the infant and the primary caregiver, normally mother. And that this is where the development of self is located, in this very early relationship. He had a particular interest in the question of narcissism. Narcissism has a really bad press, but Kohut believed that it was actually an essential part of healthy development. And he highlights many aspects of both normal and pathological narcissism. Now, he suggests that narcissism is not something that we outgrow and leave behind, but something that is transformed from the kind of global and primitive narcissism with its overtones of ruthlessness and self-centeredness. I kind of inwardly groan when I read that sentence because I recognise the addict in that statement. But we can also recognise in that the very small baby who is utterly ruthless, who is predisposed to survive. The healthy baby who will ruthlessly make use of mother or whoever is looking after the baby to get its needs met, without any thought for anybody else's needs, time, energy, situation, or whatever. So it's transformed from that to something that he describes as a mature form of self-investment and self-sustenance, of healthy self-reliance, to borrow a term probably from Bowlby in attachment theory. Because again, I think Bowlby would have a very similar kind of way of thinking about this. So it's that move away from that early self-centered position to a position of feeling self-confident. It's okay to put my needs first sometimes. It's okay to understand what it is I need and to find ways of doing that. And to feel confident that other people will be able to help and support and teach and whatever else it is that we need. But that it is a two-way process. It's not all about me. This enables a person to feel secure and confident in their ability to cope in adult life, more or less. You know, we know that there are those events in life, those what we would call traumatic experiences, traumatic life events, that will overwhelm the healthiest of position. But I'm talking about kind of normal development, the normal ups and downs of life. That non-addicts take in their stride, more or less. They have a moan, they have a whinge, they get upset, they get cross, they move on. For the addict, it breeds a resentment. It provokes that feeling of entitlement. How dare this happen to me? The world is an unfair place. This isn't right, this isn't fair, someone has to pay. All of that good stuff. So this is a good picture, according to Heinz Kohut. However, where this does not take place, for whatever reason, okay? And when I say this, I'm not saying because mother is a bad mother. I'm not saying it because mother has done something dreadful or the child has been abused, although that may be the case. I'm talking about kind of an ordinary failure that may come about, and a combination of, on the one hand, the child's own particular and unique needs, and the capacity of the mother at any one time to meet them. Going back to those babies in the maternity hospital, the baby that can be fed and that can settle down and go off to sleep, and the baby that's been fed and fed again and is still shouting for attention. So we're talking about a combination of both, because I don't want to get into any kind of idea that what I'm talking about is addiction comes from bad mothering. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm talking about is a failure of this optimal, healthy development to take place. And a robust, secure and confident self to take the person into adulthood. So when this doesn't take place, the person struggles to maintain a normal level of self-esteem. They're highly sensitive to slights, rejection or perceived criticism. Because it's like they don't have a strong enough sense of themselves to withstand it. They may have difficulties in maintaining a sense of proportion. Again, thinking about those dopamine levels in the brain. It's stress, 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 stress. Can't cope. Actually, it's just a small thing. But in that moment, it's dreadful. Self-soothing. Being able to help myself feel better. Go and have a bath. Go for a nice walk. Put the thing down that's causing me to feel angst or difficult. End the conversation with the person who's winding me up the wrong way. You know, take care of myself. Perhaps go and have a nice meal or a cup of tea. Self-soothing. Tolerating and managing frustration or conflict. And may well exhibit high levels of anger and frustration, which I think come from a sense of fear. Because at that person, at that moment in time, the person feels threatened. Because again, if we go back, the person is operating this from this very early survival mode. And when somebody comes at me with something that I can't manage, I feel under threat. So I go into survival mode. Kohut formulated the concept of something called the self-object, by which he meant an experience of others that are felt to be part of oneself and over whom we can exercise control. Now he's talking about something that happens in tiny babies, between the babies and their primary caregiver, before the baby has a sense of the other, because the baby is just consumed with themselves. They don't know it, they just are. They're in that survival mode. It's about feeling good. It's about feeling replete. It's about whatever that feeling is. Whatever that feeling is, that for the baby in that moment that it can't put words to, but the baby is okay. It's that. And in order to get that, the baby makes use of whoever is available to them. Mother, usually. So mother is not another person who responds to my need to be fed by giving me something to eat. Mother is a part of myself that I can just make use of as and when I need it. The other is a creation of me. It enables me to get my needs met, and it's really important that it's part of me because I have complete control. If I, at that point, and I would not be mature enough to be able to cope with this thought, but if I was able to have the thought that this other person is a separate person with their own mind, I'm in big trouble. Because if this other person has their own mind, they may decide not to meet my need. They may decide to abandon me, or not to feed me, or not to give me what it is I need. Then I'm in big trouble. Then I'm in really big trouble. So we can exercise control, because we don't see it as another person. We simply see the other as an extension of ourselves. A cohesive and confident self emerges from an optimal relationship between the child and his or her self-objects that allows for normal imperfections and frustration of parenting to be fully integrated. What this means is that if this process goes okay, and mum is more or less attentive to the child most of the time, and the child is not so excessively needy that the child overwhelms mother's capacity to meet the needs most of the time, the child begins to feel safe and secure. And it moves to a position whereby it can tolerate the idea that this other sometimes lets them down. And at that point, they become aware of the other as other. This is really important. We're talking about separation. Yeah? We're talking about separation. Big issue for addicts. How often do we think about that in the context of separation? People who get in these enmeshed relationships with people who are still in very enmeshed, enabling relationships with partners, parents, grandparents, all sorts of things. It's like they never got to that point where the other person could say, actually, you know, right now I'm really tired and I'm not going to give you tea right now. We're going to sit on the settee and we're going to watch the television for 5 minutes or so, and I'm going to have a cup of tea, but I'm still here and I shan't run away and I will feed you. This is the beginning of the separation process. And it's hugely important because providing the child is not overwhelmed by this experience, it develops a confidence. That's okay. I can cope with that. And that's really, really important for development. And in time, a replacement of the self-objects by the self and its functions, something called self-structures. This is what's inside us. And I think they're in here somewhere. It's kind of how I feel about myself on any given day. It's, you know, often I think of it in terms of this person doesn't seem to be coping very well with life. What's inside them? And I think by that I'm thinking about something like a self-structure that enables the self to perform the regulating, soothing, accepting and motivating functions that it was previously dependent on others to perform. So it is internalized. This external locus of control has now been internalized. And at this point, we have a viable person. We have someone who can manage on their own with appropriate dependence on others, because none of us are truly independent, but in an appropriate way that allows us this process of separation and standing on our own 2 feet, of knowing we can ask for help and that most of the time we'll get the help and support that we need, and that at times we will be able to manage on our own. And as the child grows up and gains confidence in doing okay, then more and more it comes to believe that it is a person who can manage on their own. So these self-structures that arise from this early experience of using the other as though it was simply an extension of yourself, the realization that it is not a good enough experience, and I'm sort of okay. With the right kind of help and support, I'm going to be okay. It's interesting because Kohut at the time, and most of his output was late 60s and 70s. Restoration of the Self is probably one of his sort of seminal works. And he wasn't specifically working with addiction. But in the psychoanalytic world, where many analysts were absolutely confused and overwhelmed by the addicts who were coming to them for psychotherapy because they just didn't know how to help these people. You know, because these addicts don't behave like other people. You know, they don't think symbolically. They don't tolerate these long silences and all that kind of thing. And more, Kohut became the reference point for coming to understand something of what the addict was looking for when he approached his drug or his drink or whatever the behaviour is. Because what Kohut came to think of addiction as, was a failed attempt at self-cure. And that for me, I think is quite a useful way of thinking about what it is, the purpose of the drug or the drink may be for any one individual. That it represents an attempt at self-cure. This will make me better. This will give me what I need. This will change the way I feel. And of course it's not that rational, it's not that thought through. And I think for many of us, certainly for me, this was something that I came to after some period of time of being in recovery and being in my own analysis. But I think his idea that addiction was a failed attempt as it happened, at self-cure is actually really important, because what he's talking about is that need to fill a void. Again, void is a word that often we use. People and addicts will talk about, it feels like, and this again, for me, it feels like, what's inside me? It felt like there was a hole. There was a void. There was something that wasn't there that other people seemed to have. I didn't understand it, and I didn't know what it was, and I didn't even give it a thought, but I had found a solution, or so I thought. Right, now I think we have to go back to a little bit of the neuroscience, the mind-brain relationship. What we know, that abnormalities in dopamine levels can lead people to partake in activity that gives them a dopamine high, which then becomes addictive. We know that already, because what we know is this person discovers something that delivers a better than expected response. And this is very, very, very compelling. This is great. This derives from a defect in the brain's ability to perceive, process, and act on pleasurable experience. So I do think it is important to bear in mind that what we're talking about is not something that happens by chance, that these high returns of dopamine are attractive, because actually anybody is susceptible to experiencing that in a particular way. You could say at some level that everybody has the potential to become addicted under the right conditions, if that experience delivers a particular response which for that person at that particular time experiences in a particular way that sets off a chain of events that leads to something that we then understand is addiction. So I do think that we need to understand that we're not here talking about a healthy brain, we are talking about a brain in which there exists some kind of defect around development. Around development, again, it may be organic. We don't necessarily know that. Brain scans for any individual will deliver a whole lot more information. But what we know is that this is not your ordinary brain. This is a brain that has some kind of defect. And when we go back to look at how this all starts in early life, I think it's important, because the development of the dopaminergic circuit occurs between 6 and 9 months. This is what research has been able to tell us. Growth is stimulated by high-intensity positive affect exchanges between the mother and the infant. As part of my analytic training, I had to do a 2-year infant observation. Really so interesting. You know, I met that baby for the first time when he was 2 days old, and I saw him every week for 20 months. And so I watched the baby's development in that time, just as a little person, not necessarily interacting with anybody, just watching the kind of changes and the movements, very small. But what I saw in that time was huge changes in this baby that starts off with absolute, completely and utterly helpless and dependent, to a child at 20 months who can walk up some steps with help and go down a slide. You know, who can ask for a drink, who can say no, you know, who can interact with other children, who can laugh, who can find joy in things. You know, I remember when she was 6 months old, pushing her on a swing, and suddenly she started to laugh. You know, and it was that, and she was sort of startled by it. So I think she'd never sort of properly laughed. And what it felt like was suddenly that sense of joy. It was like an outpouring of something. It was quite quickly followed by tears, which are kind of interesting, I think. But what it says to us, that around about this age, the child is beginning to discover the capacity for joy and excitement, a sense of well-being. And this comes about through the high-intensity positive effect. All that funny stuff that people do with babies, you know, woo, you know, and the child goes, ah! Yeah, this is a really important part of development. Something's getting stimulated in the brain. These circuits subserve the infant's ability to sustain high levels of sympathetic nervous system arousal. They're the neural basis of emotional excitement and joy. At this kind of stage in an infant's life, we see changes, real big changes in the way the baby behaves and reacts, the way they're stimulated, laughing, crying, making different kinds of noises, their physical appearance, the movement, the way they respond to light and sound and stimulation. All this is happening. All this is happening at this time. But then something important happens. At about 10 to 12 months, parents begin to say no. Actually, parents probably start to say no before then. But there is a sense, perhaps, that around about that age, the child is of a stable enough in themselves to be able to tolerate mother saying no. And it's really important, because actually what mother's doing is stopping that joy and excitement from going off the scale. You know, we might call it boundaries. It's that boundary that goes in place to help the child to feel safe. Because actually, much as the child wants to be excited and having a great time, there comes a point when it's all too much. You know that saying that we used to think, you know, it'll all end in tears. You know, all the relatives have come round, they're all surrounding this new little child, you know, playing in the middle of the room and showing off, and everybody's encouraging it. At some point, somebody needs to take hold of the child and say, enough. Because if not, the child will become completely overwhelmed. And this is exactly what is happening when these great surges of dopamine are flooding the midbrain. And we lose the capacity to make sensible choices because we're in that state of, I don't know, I might call it euphoria. So at about 10 to 12 months, parents begin to say no, or somebody begins to say no. And this stimulates the growth of a different circuit that regulates the parasympathetic nervous system to decrease arousal and excitement. So if you looked at it in terms of peaks and troughs, it would be like that. And this is the child being able to experience joy but not to go too far. To be able to come down and to feel okay. And why is this important? Okay, activity that's initially dependent on the caretaker as the external regulator, so it's mother or somebody else that does it. When they're mature, these circuits serve as the child's internal self. In here, the regulatory system, the foundation for affect regulation and affect tolerance. Hugely, hugely significant when we think about the difficulties that addicts have in managing their emotions. And what neuroscience is helping us to understand, and I think it's still in its infancy, is that this is an outcome of that early experience that is both a combination of the people that we are uniquely and individually when we come into the world, our experience of our environment and what we make of it. So from the outside, you can't say that, yeah, everything's going fine, because it's all taking root, it's all happening inside the person. But it's happening at that very early stage. And according to Kohut, this is the emerging self. This is the little person who is able, more or less, most of the time, to be able to manage themselves. And if that is the case, they do not have to rely on over-the-top experiences in order to keep them happy. They can find pleasure in ordinary, everyday things. For them, a drink is a drink. For them, sex is sex. It is not the better than expected reward that gives that huge surge of dopamine that takes the person back time and time and time and time again until that point where it develops the addict in the personality who is now firmly in control. So I think, for me this is quite a compelling argument, that this early development is the foundation for affect regulation and affect tolerance. The child is able to tolerate something of how they feel and to regulate their emotions, not to go too far. But what first is done for them by other people, they then learn to do themselves. And we're talking about then the move towards maturity. So, in summary, we've considered the theory that the addictive personality is created by the use of certain substances or behaviours. This seems to suggest, that what Craig Knockin is saying is that the addictive personality comes about as a consequence of the process of addiction. We've also looked at another theory that the addictive personality predisposes certain people to become addicts. That there is in certain people a predisposition that leaves them susceptible to experience certain substances and behaviours in a way that leads to addiction. We've certainly seen, I think, how the dopamine hypothesis supports both viewpoints. And this may lead us to conclude that the two theories are complementary, and in that sense could give us a more holistic understanding of the nature of treatment. Because what we know is genes are important, but we need an environment to kickstart them into action. I think that even if we look at that first one about the addictive personality as emerging from the process of addiction, for my mind that doesn't make any sense unless there is some underlying susceptibility, because not everyone becomes addicts. For some people, a drink is just a drink. However, I think that the identification and treatment of vulnerability is vital if we are to support the addict in his or her recovery, because however we might come to understand that predisposition, it doesn't go away when the person stops using. It is still there. And if we do not treat that underlying vulnerability, and I don't necessarily mean through therapy, because I think there are many ways that as addicts we can gain treatment and support in recovery, but that if we do not pay attention to this, the person is highly likely to relapse, or perhaps to develop a cross addiction, because their awareness of their propensity to experience certain behaviours or substances in particular ways leads to a certain blindness that says, well, no, it's only drink I can't have. Actually, I'm fine with Benylin cough mixture. You know, small things. You know, probably not a bottle at a time. You know, or whatever else, you know, may present itself. Because the underlying vulnerability has not been noticed, taken attention of, and treated, it remains. And actually, it gets worse. Because no longer is the person using the thing that up to that point has been the so-called solution. So that person may well be tempted to look for something else. And what we know about cross-addiction is that almost inevitably it will lead the person back to their primary addiction, time and time again. Alternatively, and again, I think this is not uncommon, the person may well develop difficulties around managing their mood, their depression, anxiety. What we often see is people who come for treatment who say, you know, I'm not an addict, I'm depressed. And that may well be so. But until the person has abstained from the substance or the behaviour for long enough, we don't really get a good clear look at it. And at that point there may be something that the person needs real good treatment for. And it's absolutely essential that they have it. Because if not, they will fall back on this attempt at self-cure, which has got them to the point that they are at. So I think that understanding more about the vulnerability is absolutely essential if we're going to help and support people in their recovery. And finally, I kind of wondered about a conclusion. This is my conclusion. And I think for me, the addictive personality that we have described as emerging from the addictive process is useful up to a point. I think it can be an extremely useful way of the person who is serious about their recovery recognizing their susceptibility to experience certain substances and behaviors in a way that may lead them back to trouble. And if that phrase, the addictive personality, is useful to that person, then of course that can be helpful. But for me, I think there's something important about being absolutely explicit. Because actually what we know, both from the dopamine hypothesis, what we know from Craig Knockin's work, what we know about a whole body of literature on addiction, is that once that person is an addict, they are an addict forevermore. There is no going back. And I am always very cautious about wanting to soften the blow. You know, people say, will I be an addict forever? Yes. And that's a bitter pill to swallow, but it's real. And I think that if we duck that issue, then we let our clients down. And I think we fool ourselves. So for my mind, at that point, whether I look at it from an emotional, developmental point of view, whether I look at it from a neurobiochemical view or whatever, at that point, I am an addict. And that's good to know. Because if I know that I am an addict, then I also know what I can do in order to maintain my recovery. I know it, I know it, I know it. And I just wonder about addiction prone. Might be for me an alternative term which might include the notion of predisposition. Because I think also too, it is important to think about the genes. You know, it is important to think about the family history of addiction and alcoholism. It's one of the things that we do when clients come into treatment. We ask about the family, we ask about incidents of addiction, alcoholism, eating disorders, other kind of things, depression, mental health. We take a history, we find out about people's background. And what we can see is that if you put together the person, if you like, who has something that we might call this vulnerability, this predisposition, if you put together that with an increased likelihood to choose addiction as the solution because of the family history, okay, it's not inevitable, but it's there, we can't ignore it, then we may be looking at somebody who has a higher than average chance of seeking or using addiction as their means of managing the deficit that they feel inside them. So for me, this is somebody who is addiction prone. It's just a thought. Anyway, that is about all I have to say.